It had all the makings of a great story.
Dewey LeBoeuf, which had more than 1,300 lawyers and 26 offices around the world, has been in a slow-motion meltdown.
It had a fall from a great height, one of the most prestigious and profitable law firms. Its origins more than 100 years old.
It's been sort of a rocky 6 months for the firm.
A lot of partners are extraordinarily angry right now.
Of course people were going to be interested in that.
It was the legal world's equivalent of the collapse of the Lehman Brothers.
Dewey fired secretaries and associates en masse earlier this week.
I was going to say I haven't done anything like this in a long time, but I think the real answer is ever.
They had built up through a strategy that didn't work.
They're accused of massive financial fraud being compared to Enron.
Millionaire big shots busted for allegedly cooking the books.
The fact that people got criminally indicted, I don't think anybody saw that coming.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, okay. My name is Steve Davis, and I was the chairman at Dewey LeBoeuf almost the entire time the firm was in existence. I first thought about being a lawyer, I believe, when I was in high school.
The story of the collapse of the megafirm Dewey LeBoeuf begins in 1977. A young Yale Law School grad named Stephen Davis joined a mid-sized energy and insurance firm named LeBoeuf Lamb. Davis was elevated to partner in 1985 and eventually became its chair.
LeBoeuf traced its origins back to the 1920s. It was a very profitable, mid-size type of firm. It represented utilities, energy companies, insurance companies. Maybe not the sexiest client base, but it was a solid, profitable firm.
At its peak, LeBoeuf Lamb had approximately 650 lawyers. While still predominantly a New York firm, it also had offices in Washington, London, and Moscow. But the firm's success created a unique legal industry problem.
One of the real downsides of that industry concentration, you begin to trip over yourself. We had kind of maxed out in terms of those sectors, and the conflicts issues were becoming more and more real.
Steve Davis had the idea that being part of a medium-sized firm really had limitations.
Davis and his team felt they had two options: shrink into a smaller boutique firm of a few hundred lawyers specializing in a handful of practice areas, or grow into a super firm that could attract blue-chip clients across a broad range of practice areas.
A lot of firms felt that pressure. And a lot of consultants, legal consultants, were telling people, you got to get bigger, you got to be national, in fact, you have to be global, that there are only going to be a few big global players.
Davis decided that we are going to grow. We are going to turn LeBoeuf from this well-respected, profitable, mid-size-ish New York firm into something much larger, into something much more powerful, into something with global reach.
Aspirationally, we would look at a Skadden, at a Cleary Gottlieb, and say we'd love to be more like that. And we began quite an ambitious program of lateral hiring.
Decades ago, the theory was you would go to your law firm and you would stay there for your whole career. But as time went on, law firms realized that they could become much more profitable by hiring away superstars from other firms.
With growth in its sights, Davis and his team at LeBoeuf Lamb went all in. In one high-profile move, Davis lured a Debevoise and Plimpton star named Ralph Ferrara with an eye-popping $16 million signing bonus.
When we all read about it, our mouths were kind of hanging open, like, seriously?
These are lawyers. They're not professional athletes. $16 million is a huge sum.
I and others understood what it would require. It was quite daunting.
It was a high-risk, high-reward signing, but one that ultimately paid off and signaled Davis's ambition to transform LeBoeuf Lamb into an elite New York law firm.
I mean, Ralph brought practice area that really was at a level that we certainly never had before.
When Ralph came over, clients followed, and one of those clients generated revenue for LeBoeuf of something like $40 million. So that was, despite being very expensive, a very smart hire for LeBoeuf.
You have to go for the very top, the A-plus players. If you don't, your chances of success are very limited.
In early 2007, LeBoeuf Lamb was on its way to fulfilling Davis's ambitions. In addition to Ferrara, over the past year, Davis had brought in nearly 24 partners. The American lawyer dubbed LeBoeuf a rainmaker magnet. There was just one problem.
One of the dangers of lateral partner hiring is that the revolving door spins both ways. You can get great talent through lateral hiring, but you can also lose talent.
That year, Davis feared that a dispute with one of LeBoeuf's top lawyers made the firm vulnerable.
We were faced with losing one of the real high-level, high-profitability groups within the insurance practice.
Davis felt there was only one way to protect the firm if the insurance team fled: a merger.
I was put in touch with management of Dewey Ballantine and started up discussions about a potential merger of the two firms.
Dewey Ballantine had been one of New York's most prestigious law firms. Its namesake, Thomas Dewey, was a former governor of New York and, famously, came within a hair of becoming president of the United States.
It was a firm that was very prestigious and a big part of the New York and U.S. legal community.
You know, we forget now, but it was perceived as among the toniest firms on Wall Street.
If you had asked people in, say, 1970 to name the top 5 New York-based firms, I think it would have been Cravath and Sullivan and Cromwell, and I think Dewey Ballantine would have been in that list.
But by the 1980s, Dewey Ballantine was in a slow decline. Profits per partner, a key industry metric of a firm's financial health, started to slip.
Dewey Ballantine was not the firm it once was. It was not as profitable, and it was experiencing some money troubles.
I think everybody was kind of shocked when they heard the news of Dewey merging with LeBoeuf because they seemed like two vastly different firms.
It's become a widely accepted belief in the legal industry that the merger was doomed from the start. But Davis disputes this narrative. He says a pre-merger report from McKinsey showed the two firms actually had much in common.
The hours billed seemed to be pretty close to the hours billed by the LeBoeuf side of the house. There didn't seem to be a lot of client conflicts. They even found that the law schools the Dewey Ballantine lawyers had gone to matched up pretty closely with the spread of law schools of the lawyers at LeBoeuf Lamb.
Davis and his management team saw an opportunity. He took inspiration from the merger of two mid-tier London firms, Coward Chance and Clifford Turner, to become the UK powerhouse, Clifford Chance.
In effect, a new UK magic circle firm was created. And that was the parallel that I had in mind with Dewey.
On October 1st, 2007, Dewey Ballantine and LeBoeuf Lamb officially became Dewey and LeBoeuf. The merged firm moved into Dewey's offices, and Steve Davis was named its chairman.
One common take on it was that Dewey married money and LeBoeuf married up.
I don't think they were marrying for money. I might change the statement and say they were marrying for management.
The question of management would prove to become one of the key tensions roiling Dewey and LeBoeuf throughout its existence. The two firms came from opposite sides of a growing divide over how law firms were run.
Law firms began as small partnerships, governed by the partners themselves, financed by the equity put in by the partners themselves. That works when you have 10 partners, 20 partners, maybe even 50 partners. Now you have law firms with hundreds of partners, located not just in one location, but increasingly around the world. Law firms are beginning to recognize that they have a governance structure which was set up for one reality, and they're now living in a completely different kind of reality.
That's where Steve Davis came in. His style, a corporate model with C-suite leaders, honed during his time leading LeBoeuf Lamb, would be the style of management for the new combined firm. However,
Mergers of equals are really hard because each firm thinks our culture should be the culture that prevails, and yet it can't be either. It has to be a new culture.
I used to jokingly talk about who decides what kind of plants go into the partners' offices, and do you really want to have a committee of partners making those decisions? Are those better left to administrators? Having partners in charge of all these business decisions is not a very efficient approach.
It turned out maybe that a lot of those Dewey partners didn't want to be managed in that way.
The first year of the merger, in my view, started off quite well.
Initially, things seemed fine, at least to outside observers. It had more revenue. It had something like 24 offices and a lawyer headcount, I think, in the 4 figures.
The first 3 quarters of 2008 for the new firm were actually quite good. The fourth quarter was entirely different. Major practice areas in the firm came to a screeching halt.
We're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
2-year note yields went from 190 to 166.
It was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
The financial crisis, was devastating to law firms, particularly law firms that had high-end corporate practices.
The finance practice went from 100 miles an hour to 0. M&A work stopped in its tracks. And the firm's executive committee met and really talked about survival. And what we ultimately decided was that we would embark on massive cost cutting. We had to look at major layoffs of people. We had to look at office closings. It was an absolutely agonizing period, but we felt we had to do it.
What made Dewey particularly vulnerable is that, they had these huge payouts for these big-time or supposedly big-time partners that they had lured into the firm.
One theory that has often been cited for ultimately leading to Dewey's demise is that the firm's strategy of luring rainmakers with large, multi-year contracts stifled its ability to manage the financial crisis. Multiple news outlets reported that before its collapse, Dewey had more than 100 partners with special compensation arrangements.
Financial guarantees to partners could be seen as a necessary evil. If you want to bring over a talented lawyer from another firm, you need to compensate them for the risk they're taking. So you give them a guarantee.
It's very fuzzy what they were doing, right? They were reported mostly as being guarantees. Whether they were or not, that's certainly the way they were reported.
But Steve Davis says the conventional wisdom that the contracts were guaranteed, and thus Dewey was obligated to pay regardless of the firm's financial health, has it all wrong.
The vast bulk of them were not guarantees. They were target compensation agreements. Target compensation agreements that we felt we wanted to honor. But we wanted to honor them because they were among our most productive people.
In other words, from Davis's perspective, guarantee or not, he was going to pay his top rainmakers.
There's a cliche in legal circles that 20% of the partners produce 80% of the revenues. What we found was that 5% of the partners produced almost 50% of the revenues. And that group of 5%, we could not lose. We simply couldn't lose them. That is a real world concern, and that was why we employed this technique.
I think the first news that a lot of us heard about Dewey and LeBoeuf's troubles was that it was having cash flow issues.
It was like drip, drip, drip of information about Dewey's collapse.
There were reports that it wasn't making its payments under a pension to retired partners.
And then, of course, associates started to talk. And that's when you got the sense that something is truly amiss here.
You saw Mort Pierce and his M&A group leave. You saw Jeff Kessler, the renowned sports lawyer, leave. you saw all of these top partners, the most profitable partners at Dewey, heading for the exits.
The thing they are most terrified of is what you might call a partner run. If people think your firm is in trouble, they start to come to try to recruit your partners.
At the end of the day, when it looked like the money wasn't going to come through, they had nothing else keeping them there. Many of them hadn't been at Dewey that long. Many of them had a I'm out for myself kind of mentality.
We hadn't built that loyalty and glue in the organization to keep people together, to see their way through the hard times.
In mid-March 2012, the 4 leaders of the firm's highly profitable insurance team resigned. It would prove to be a fatal blow. On May 28th, less than 5 years after the once promising merger of 2 powerful New York law firms, Dewey and LeBoeuf formally filed for bankruptcy.
It was an extraordinarily depressing day for me personally. I am a big believer that whoever is the head of an organization is responsible for what happens at that organization. For that, I feel personally responsible. I feel an immense sense of really that I owe all these people an apology. At the end of the day, I do believe it was my responsibility. I have to accept that, and I have to live with it.
Cuffed and in custody, former leaders of a powerhouse law firm now defunct.
They lied and masked the firm's financial shortfallings. The scheme deceived lenders, investors, and others into believing the firm was in far better financial condition than it actually was.
The prosecutions that were brought, which in my view were absolutely inappropriate and unnecessary.
I think that the Manhattan DA, Cy Vance, overcharged the case initially. And in the end, the jury in the Dewey criminal prosecution could not agree on a verdict.
Davis was ultimately given a deferred prosecution deal. It meant he would not be permitted to practice law in New York for 5 years. After multiple trials stretching years, only Dewey's chief financial officer, Joel Sanders, was ever convicted.
There isn't always something criminal when a law firm collapses. A lot of it is sometimes just mismanagement. A lot of it is sometimes just greed, but non-criminal greed.
A decade later, the wounds from Dewey's collapse are still fresh for the lawyers who lived it. While many top partners went on to lucrative jobs at new firms, none agreed to participate in this film. Stephen Davis was the only former Dewey partner willing to go on record about what happened. Today, Davis lives in London, where he does work for a litigation finance firm. He has no plans to practice law again.
In some ways, I feel sorry for Steve Davis. I mean, I don't think he was a bad actor in all this. You know, if anything, his fault was probably that he dreamt a little too big and went a little too far. But you know, you can't fault somebody for dreaming big. And I think in some ways he was kind of a tragic figure, frankly.
I think Dewey was in a way the perfect storm. The Great Recession came along, there were culture conflicts after the merger, partners started heading for the exits. The Dewey and LeBoeuf collapse is the most famous law firm collapse in history.
If they had merged 2002, 2003, they'd probably still be here today. The fact that they merged in 2007, went on a, spent like a drunken sailor, buying up practices and people, and then the world fell off the cliff, that put them in a really difficult position.
I think that in its brief existence, the firm did some good things. Unfortunately, all that has disappeared in the chaos and the turmoil that resulted from the bankruptcy. So And as I say, as the head of the organization, I have to accept responsibility for that.